Welcome to the United States Institute of Peace. Thank you so much for coming. I do apologize. As you can see, we have a very packed house. We have some folks standing in the back. We have some folks in the overflow facility. And I think that it's testament to the fact that we have an extremely exciting discussion for you today. I think as topical as it gets, to talk about Afghanistan and counterinsurgency and what's really going on the ground there. My name is Alex Thier, and I chair our Afghanistan working group here. And as many of you know, the U.S. Institute of Peace has been focusing increasingly efforts on Afghanistan, both by bringing people around Washington to talk about issues, but more importantly, by working directly in Afghanistan itself. We have an office on the ground there that is growing, and you can read about some of the work that we do online at www.usip.org. We are also, for the first time, streaming live to the web today. At least I think we are. And so for those of you out there in the Ethernet, welcome as well. Today, I think we have a very interesting discussion and two people who know an enormous amount about their subjects. So let me introduce them briefly. There are longer bios outside. And in hopes of having an interesting and provocative discussion, what we are going to do today is have a brief introduction by both of our speakers. And then I'm going to engage them in a discussion. As may be evident from the lines on my face, I just got off the plane from Kabul on Monday. And so a lot of the things that both David and Andrew have been focusing on for the last few years are happening right now today on the ground in a very intensive way in Afghanistan. And so we're going to use some time to explore that, and then at the end get a chance to have some audience questions as well. Let me briefly introduce our speakers. Dr. David Kilcullen is currently a partner at the Crumpton Group and a senior non-resident fellow at the Center for a New American Security. As most of you know him, he has been a somewhat ubiquitous figure for the last few years in the debate over counterinsurgency, what that means, what it looks like, and what it should look like. He's served as an advisor both to General Petraeus and Secretary Condoleezza Rice, and soon to be, if not already, in a senior advisory capacity to General Stanley McChrystal, the new commander of United States and international forces in Afghanistan. David is also the author of a pretty new book, Oxford University Press, The Accidental Guerrilla, which is a very interesting read, and maybe he'll give us a few of the highlights from that. And I think most importantly, you know, David has been appearing a lot, Charlie Rose, I think Colbert Report, but word got to me that he was quite sad that he hadn't had a chance to speak here with me, and so we invited him today to do that. To his left, Dr. Andrew Wilder is, I will admit up front, although hopefully this won't bias my questioning, one of my oldest friends from the region. I first met Andrew in 1993. He was born in Pakistan, raised there most of his life, wrote a PhD about Pakistani politics, and has been working on aid in Afghanistan and Pakistan for coming on, I think, 2.5 decades now.
See the result.
Yeah. When I met Andrew 16 years ago, he was already one of the people that everybody told me to go and talk about Afghanistan to. And so now he's only had 16 more years of knowledge. Particularly one of the fascinating things that Andrew did is he started up basically a think tank in Afghanistan called AREU, the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit, which has consistently put out the best sort of policy-focused, aid-focused research that anybody's done anywhere in the world, and they're right there in Kabul doing it. Since then, he moved to become the director of research at the Feinstein Center of International Studies at Tufts University.
Feinstein International Center.
International Center at Tufts University. So we're going to begin with about 10 to 15 minutes maximum from each of them, and then go into discussion. So let's start with you, David.
Thanks, Alex. And yeah, I had actually been lying awake in a dark room for the last few months wondering why you hadn't invited me, but so I'm delighted to be here. Okay, I can do that? Is that what
Yeah,
what
sure.
for you? All right,
Yep.
sure. Can you see me now? Excellent. I'm just going to give some brief opening remarks, and I thought what I would do is try to put Andrew's discussion, which is going to be very detailed and specific, into a more general context in terms of where we are in Afghanistan now, how we got here, and where we're likely to go from here. I also just want to start very briefly by talking about aid or foreign assistance in context. We've seen in the last 10 years or so both a quantitative and a qualitative transformation in US foreign assistance. The quantitative shift is fairly easy to state. In 2000, the total US foreign assistance budget was around $9 billion from all sources. Now it's about $26 billion. So we've seen a very substantial growth in the foreign assistance budget over the last 10 years or so. Under the new president, President Obama, there's a plan to take it to $50 billion. So it's going to be 5 times larger if that comes about within the next 5 years to where it was in 2000. So we have basically a tsunami of cash. And we have an aid organization of between 2,000 and 2,200 people, primarily structured to manage the flow of that cash and to let contracts to implementing partners to go ahead and carry out the actual work of development. There's some question as to whether an organization that small, structured that way, can handle the sorts of resources that are now going to be directed in the foreign assistance structure. The other very important shift is a qualitative shift. Last year, for the first time in history, more than 50% of total US foreign assistance was delivered in conflict or post-conflict environments. Yet we still have policies and organizations and structures across the aid community within the US government that are set up for a basic poverty alleviation approach in a peacetime environment. And one of the things that aid as an organization is thinking through and dealing with right now is how do you change the organization, or do you, to do its mission in a primarily conflict or post-conflict environment. So that's the sort of background of that from the aid perspective. Let me now just talk about Afghanistan. So where are we? We've just started a surge in Afghanistan. We're not calling it a surge. General McChrystal's calling it an augmentation because he wants to send the message to Afghans that this is permanent. We're going to augment the level of effort and maintain it. On the civilian side, somebody, and I'm sure it was a man, came up with the term uplift to describe the civilian component of the augmentation. So it's not really a surge, but we have sent in, at the moment, 21,000 extra US troops, about 2,500 European NATO troops and police, and we're about to send around 200 to 300 civilians into the country to sort of get in there and do more with a lot more resources. We've started to see already the first impact of that surge of troops in the heavy fighting that's happening right now in Helmand. British fighting very heavily in an area called Nut Ali in the centre of Helmand, just west of the river. The Marines fighting further to the south in an area around Kanishin known as the Fishhook, and then further up again in the Helmand River Valley, and some pretty significant fighting going on in Helmand right now. In Kandahar also there's a lot of violence going on, but not the same sort of a heavy combat that's happening in Helmand. My friend Andrew Exum described what's happening in Kandahar as a silent war of intimidation and terrorizing the population by Taliban cells and others, basically targeting the leadership of the community and trying to intimidate people. The President on the 27th of March gave the statement of the new strategy, which he articulated as a counterinsurgency strategy designed to meet a counter-terrorism objective of defeating al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan and preventing a return. That whole strategy, with the appointment of Richard Holbrooke as the special representative and a new sort of series of power centres within the US structure, has resulted in a new team, a new strategy, some new resources, and arguably some new objectives, all of which have been somewhat disorganised to start with. But I think we're starting to see the pattern of how we're going to settle down. So that's where we are right now. Let's talk about quickly how we got here. You remember the rapid victory in 2001 over the Taliban forces, and I guess a couple of numbers are relevant in that respect. On the day that Kandahar fell, the last Taliban stronghold, 7th of December 2001, the US had 110 CIA officers and just over 300 special forces operators in the south of Afghanistan. So only roughly 400 people. But there were 50,000 Afghans fighting on our side against the Taliban. That, to my mind, is the real cause of the rapid collapse of the Taliban. It was a partnership, an informal one, between the international community and Afghans at the local level that led to that. Now, we've all spent a lot of time out on the ground in Afghanistan, and I've talked to hundreds of Afghans on the ground in southern and eastern Afghanistan since about 2005. No one has ever used the term invasion to describe what happened in 2001. They say, we kicked the Taliban out, you helped us. But then there's a sense of disappointment about what happened afterward, and in particular about the return of warlords and other people who'd been important elites in the country before the Taliban had come to power, their return to positions of power and dividing up the spoils of government and the largesse of international aid and development amongst themselves and their friends, rather than directing that to the benefit of the Afghan population. The Taliban went quiet. They did not actually move out of the country in large numbers. Al-Qaeda did into Pakistan, but a lot of the Taliban simply went quiet, went home and waited to see what would happen. And there was a period of relative calm in Afghanistan for a year or so, and then violence started to come up again in 2002, 2003. It really spiked in the middle of 2006, and since that time, we've seen a dramatic deterioration in the situation. If you were to draw a line between Herat and Jalalabad now, across basically the top third, bottom two-thirds of Afghanistan, that bottom two-thirds of the country is now entirely Taliban-held or Taliban-contested. So there's a significant war going on in the bottom two-thirds of Afghanistan. Violence is up about 550% since 2006. The spread of the insurgency has roughly tripled. It depends on whose figures you look at, but the Taliban from 2006 to now have probably expanded 2 to 3 times. The numbers of assassinations, people being kidnapped, the level of incidents have all continued to rise. Now, the underlying causes of that, I can state them pretty quickly and we can talk about them later. Too few resources, strategic inattention, not only the distraction of Iraq, but also an international community that sort of did what it needed to do for Afghanistan in 2001 and then hoped that the thing would run on autopilot without too much continuing attention. An approach of fighting the insurgents rather than fighting the insurgency. An approach that focused on top-down institution building with the central institutions of the nation state rather than local-level delivery of services that were relevant to the population's grievances and relevant to the concerns of local people. A failure to ask the question, what kind of state are we trying to build in Afghanistan? And as a result, some pretty incoherent programs coming forward. At the political level, one of the problems has been the failure to create national institutions that are not personalised. And so there's no political party that's associated with President Karzai. He just has personal following on the basis of tribal or ethnic association, or on the basis of delivering goods to individuals in return for their support. That's kind of how we got to where we are now. Where do we go from here? Well, I think most people think that President Karzai is going to win the election. Not a lot of people think that the election is going to be fair. And so I think one of the things we're going to see after the 20th of August is President Karzai returning to power, but with substantially reduced legitimacy. And we may actually see a spike of violence after the election as people react to that. There will certainly be an increase in incidents in the next year or so in Afghanistan, simply because we now have 21,000 extra troops fighting in the country. So that will generate a lot more violence. The issues of governance or poor governance and government abuse still seem to be the most important grievances in large parts of the country. But aid effectiveness is fairly regularly slated as fairly low by most Afghans in polling. It's the 9th winter of the Afghan war that we're about to embark on after the elections. It's been a very, very long campaign. And the Taliban strategy, looking at it from here, seems to be one of exhaustion, to basically wait us out till we get tired and go home. And you can see in the way that they're organising the population, intimidating the population, not fighting the coalition forces, not fighting the Afghan government, but just trying to sort of keep their powder dry and wait for another day, that they're trying to keep a force in being, establish control over the population, and wait for the international community to get tired and leave, with an eye on the civil war round 2 against the remnants of the Northern Alliance after we leave. Breaking that is going to be all about governance, rule of law, development at the local level. But you can't do that by just sending civilian teams out on the ground. You have to work with a legitimate Afghan government, and that is one of the critical weaknesses that we have right now. So we're putting in extra troops. We've got a new counterinsurgency approach. We'll definitely see some improvement on the security front in the next year or two. But we really have to deal with these underlying causes that I talked about before. Otherwise, the sources of instability won't really be addressed, and it will just be a temporary fix. Most insurgents defeat the counterinsurgent by causing the home government to lose confidence and give up. They're not going to defeat us on the ground in Afghanistan, but they could defeat us in London, in Washington, in Ottawa, and cause the international community to pull out. And that's when we would see them move. So let me stop there, because I've thrown up a lot of issues, but I think it's appropriate to let Andrew talk in detail about aid now, and then we'll pick these up in more detail after.
Terrific. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Alex and USIP, for organizing this event. I'm not sure I can talk in detail because we've been strictly told we have 15 minutes, but I'll do my best. Basically, this provides me a good opportunity to present some very preliminary findings from the first year of research for a project we've been doing at the Feinstein Center at Tufts, looking at the effectiveness of aid in achieving stabilization objectives. There's been a lot of aid effectiveness discussions and debate and study around aid's effectiveness in achieving sort of humanitarian and development objectives, but actually surprisingly little in terms of looking at aid's effectiveness in achieving stabilization objectives. And as an increasing percentage of our aid, as David just described, is being spent in post-conflict and conflict settings, and to a considerable extent, because we want to achieve stability out of that aid, I think it's very surprising that to date there's been very little effort to try to determine the impact of this aid on stabilization. And as you know, I mean, the basic assumption is that aid is an effective and important stabilization tool. And you often hear this described in terms like aid and security are two sides of the same coin. And they're viewed very much as complementary, but I think some of the research we're doing shows that it could be complementary. It could be that in many cases they're contradictory. And in some cases, there's very little impact of aid on the stabilization at all. But the assumption is having a big impact on policy, as we've already heard. I mean, one is lots more money for reconstruction and development. So there are indeed many people who are benefiting tremendously from this assumption that aid has a very significant stabilization and security benefit. Another aspect, policy impact of the assumption, is a lot more money is now being channeled through the military to do development and reconstruction work. And I don't have the exact figures, but I hear that next year in Afghanistan, I think we're expecting the CERT budget to be doubled again to about $1.6 billion, which is beginning to rival, will I think be rivaling USAID's budget in Afghanistan. So a lot more money being channeled through military and a lot more implementation through the military. And the third one is that an increasing percentage is being spent in areas that are insecure based on this assumption. And certainly we've been doing research in northern Afghanistan, in Balkh and Faryab province, but also then Paktia and Rozgan and Helmand, more in the southeast and south. And when you do, it's hard to have any conversation in northern Afghanistan or even in central Afghanistan where people raise this issue of why, sort of the peace penalty. Why are we being penalized because we're peaceful? All the resources are going down south. I think in 2007, Akbar, an NGO coordinating body, published a study showing that more than 50% of the entire U.S. aid budget in Afghanistan was being spent in 4 southern provinces out of 34 provinces in all in Afghanistan. But I think, let's see if I, how do I make this go? Oh, okay. I think there's a lot of reasons, once you actually start scratching the surface of this assumption, that questions begin to quickly emerge. We have the assumption that reconstruction and modernization efforts are stabilizing rather than destabilizing. And I think that's something I'll talk about in a minute. Another one, poverty and lack of reconstruction are important cause of the conflict. That's a very strongly held view. Aid projects win hearts and minds. And again, it's one of the things that helps legitimize the government. And then another assumption, which is the key objective of the PRTs, is to extend the reach of the central government. And there's a strongly held assumption that this is indeed stabilizing. But when you actually look at the evidence, starting historically, it starts to break down. Historically in Afghanistan, if you look at it, generally it's the times when we've been trying to push, or when a modernization agenda has been being pushed, those are the times of greatest instability. In terms of King Amanullah from 1919 to 1929, well known for pushing a modernization agenda, which quickly got him into trouble and chased out of power. I think more recently, it's important to remember that in the 1950s, 1960s, Afghanistan was actually one of the largest recipients of foreign aid, per capita foreign aid money in the world, because of the Cold War attempts to use aid to win hearts and minds. And I recently came across a document that USAID had some consultants prepare, I think around 1988. And it was 89, just as the Soviets were beginning to withdraw. Let's do a study on the lessons learned from our aid programs 1950 to 1979 as we prepare for a new aid program. And this slide begins to capture some of the findings from this study done on our previous experience in terms of doing aid in Afghanistan. Lots of focus on big infrastructure programs. The Helmand-Arghandab Valley Authority being the most notable one. But soon, by the end of the 60s, the realization that all these projects have been done, but there really weren't the human resources to run or maintain a lot of these infrastructure programs. And I think that should be a cautionary note for, as we're investing hundreds of millions of dollars now in infrastructure, road building projects in particular, with very little Afghan capacity to maintain, and certainly very little resources in terms of maintaining these in the future. It's not clear where the budgets are going to come to managing these things. I won't go through all of them, but if you can read through some of these, civil service reform, lots of efforts on that, largely with disappointing results. Again, the assumption that economic development is a panacea, but often it just raised more questions. High staff turnover of USAID, and this was in the 70s and 60s when we actually had staff staying for quite a big time, was identified as a problem. Afghan officials highly skilled at negotiating their way around difficult reform issues. I think that's, we see a bit of that today. Basically, this confidence in our technological abilities and importing our ideas from the West to the Afghan context, often inappropriately so. That was highlighted as a problem. But this is the conclusion of this report, and then that the use of aid for short-term political objectives in the competition with the Soviet Union tended to distort sound economic rationale for development, and in the process to weaken our longer-term political interests. Aid as a tool of diplomacy had its limitations when politically motivated commitments are at a much higher level and promise more than can reasonably be delivered in economic returns. And I think this very neatly captures much of what we're trying to do now, and I think that we need to pay a little more attention to the lessons of the past in terms of our current assumptions. Very briefly, the study we've been doing is in these 6 provinces, looking at perceptions of security and insecurity, what are the drivers of conflict, perceptions of the aid programs, perceptions of aid actors, and indeed, are there examples of projects that clearly have had a stabilization benefit? And a very, very strong finding, and David already alluded to it, and anyone who's been spent time in Afghanistan recently will, I think, will resonate. It's very rare to find people coming up to you and talking about the real success of our aid efforts and how happy they are and pleased they are with what we've done. Generally, it's resoundingly negative perceptions of the aid effort at a time when more aid work is being done in Afghanistan probably than ever before in Afghanistan's history. But it's very common in interviews to people say nothing has been done, when clearly actually lots has been done, or not enough has been done, or they got more than we did. And I think in a zero-sum society, this issue of you build a well in one village, well, 10 other villages get irritated because they didn't get one, or you do 10 wells and the people wanted it, but there's 100 wells in the village. And so that dynamic is there. I think a lot of it based to the very high expectations people have had. Corruption comes up in every interview. People talking about that. Pretty much everyone, PRTs, government, NGOs, contractors, it just comes out in all the interviews. Perception, lots of aid money wasted, lots of broken promises, and this is a particular problem with PRT transitions. One PRT is there, they go out, meet officials, they decide to do a project, they actually design it, then you have a rotation. The next PRT team does not have to do what the PRT previous group agreed to. So a lot of problems like that and a perception of broken promises. A lot of complaints that a lot of the projects don't employ locals. And especially a lot of these road building contracts, often it's built into the contract that they're meant to hire locals, but that's not enforced. And too little consultation of communities. But basically, lots of complaints about the nature of aid work. There's also questions about the sustainability of impact. In some areas, people are happy when the project's being done. Then the project ends, and then it's, well, what next? What are you going to do now? And so this idea that you can do a project and somehow this win hearts and minds, I think is quite simplistic. There were some examples of positive perceptions, and in particular was the National Solidarity Program, which is being implemented by the Ministry of Rural Reconstruction and Development, usually through NGO and contractor implementing partners. And clearly there's problems with that as well in some areas, but in general, we heard more positive things about that. And I think largely because people talked about that there's a process involved, that talking to local communities, there's an engagement, the communities have greater say in what's being done, they're involved in that process, and a relationship is built in the process. And I think that's one of the critical things where I think aid programs have the potential to have a stabilization benefit in terms of legitimizing interaction between, say, aid actors and local communities. But that we rarely capitalized on that, again, with the rapid rotations of teams, or in the very large programs, there's sort of a faceless contracting mechanisms, and contract gets subcontracted and subcontracted, and often 5 levels of contractors on a project. And I think that potential for building relationships is rarely realized. But one thing that's come out in the research, in addition to the unpopularity, is there's a lot of reasons to, in some areas, that there's a lot of evidence that some of these projects are indeed destabilizing rather than stabilizing. And I think we need to be spending a lot more, investing a lot more in analysis on the whole political economy of aid. Who are the winners and losers in this process? A lot of the construction companies bidding are linked to real significant power brokers back in Kabul. Again, there's a lot of corruption in the business. There's a lot of flipping of contracts. One group will bid it and then sell the contract on to others and take commissions. There's lots of collusion that takes place between aid contractors. Some of their it's a very good time, people told me, to be an engineer in Afghanistan. Some of these, the engineers from within the aid contractors, or even some of the translators within institutes like PRTs, provide insider information on some of the contracting. The delegitimizing impact on government and the international community of the massive corruption and the perceptions of massive corruption. We also have anecdotal evidence of cases where contractors cause insecurity for rival contractors, because the stakes are high here. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. And there's a case recently I heard from Nangarhar where one contractor basically underbid a very important person who had a construction company and was basically told to withdraw his bid, and when he didn't, he was killed. We also have quite a bit of anecdotal evidence that in some of these insecure areas on the road building projects, quite a bit of the security budget gets actually paid to the Taliban, not to attack the construction company workers in their building through that area. So basically just the need to understand that process better. And I just got back from Rosgan in June and July, and it was interesting there. Rosgan is an interesting example because it's viewed as one of the success stories. I mean, the Dutch have been leading the PRT. The Economist had an article on the Dutch model in the last couple months. BBC had a big piece on the Dutch success story, a star performer. And indeed, at one level, security in 3 of the 7 districts of Rosgan has improved. But when you actually go out into the communities and talk to people, they don't view it as security. They basically view we've strengthened one faction, which was linked to Karzai, he appointed a Popolzai governor early on named John Muhammad Khan. He has a cousin named Matiullah, who basically runs a militia there. We pay his militia under the guise of the Afghan Highway Police, which was formally disbanded, to provide security for the roads. He also has one of the biggest construction companies, which gets contracts for the road. They have their key players in government. And so the perception you get is, okay, 2 minutes left, is that this aid, we've created security, but as one Afghan in an interview say, it's the security of the warlord, it's not the security of government. And just 2 weeks before we were there, there was a shootout just in Tarinkot, the provincial capital, between this militia force, his men, and the Afghan National Police, in which one of the militia workers was killed. Well, the militia guy basically then sent his men to go arrest the ANP person and then tortured him. And the guy saying, well, shouldn't, if we have security, the police be arresting the illegal militia members, not vice versa. So again, perceptions of security differed considerably in that case. And then that other assumption in terms of extending the reach of the central government. Again, we have a real serious problem in this area. In a lot of the places, the government was perceived to be the #1 cause of insecurity. And if our strategy is to extend the reach of this government, I think that's a real fundamental flaw with our current counterinsurgency strategy. And these are just some quotes of, very common and very much, again, the #1 cause that came up in interviews of perceptions of insecurity is the government. And maybe in the question and answer we can come back to that in terms of that whole piece of the strategy. And also, I won't go into it, but the whole assumptions around roads and stabilization, I think, is something maybe we can talk more about. More and more of our resources are being pumped into road building, and as we see increases in CERT budget, I think we'll see lots more. And there's these very common perceptions that these road building are central to our stabilization agenda. But again, I would argue there's not much evidence for that, and there's considerable evidence that in some cases, as some would argue, whoops. Oh, and yeah, I go to the last one, yeah. That this would be the perception of an alternative interpretation of road building. Again, in Paktia, the PRT there had over $40 million of road building and active projects, and probably another $40 million under consideration. I mean, this is really much the focus of where a lot of the resources are going now, based on an assumption which I think when you actually look at more closely is a lot more debatable. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. So we will definitely come back to the roads question because you both have some interesting thoughts about that. But let me start with a question to you, David. The success of counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, I think, principally so far is that it's been reduced to a bumper sticker. Clear, hold, build. Everywhere you go, I was telling David before, I was in a meeting at the embassy about rule of law strategy, and someone piped up with the idea that everything in the rule of law strategy for Afghanistan should be put into the clear, hold, build category. So clear, hold, build has taken over people's minds. Can you tell us what that means? And very specifically, and you were talking about Helmand right now. I mean, give us a granular picture of a district where there is an operation going on and how you would apply that to a district or a locality.
Mm. Well, you know, I think the critical issue is that you have to distinguish between fighting the insurgents and fighting the insurgency. And what we've done in Afghanistan in a lot of cases has been enemy-centric. That is, we've been going out, chasing the bad guys around, trying to kill or capture the enemy or the insurgents, the guerrillas, and thinking that if you remove the guerrillas, you remove the source of instability. Whereas, in fact, we need to start doing a lot more work on identifying and directly targeting the causes of instability in each of these districts that we're trying to stabilise. And I see my colleague Sloan Mann up the back there sitting against the window, that he's responsible for a lot of the excellent work that's being done right now in country in trying to reorient people away from that chase the bad guys mentality to a mentality of identifying and targeting the sources of instability. Where clear, hold, build fits into that, you're right, it's a bumper sticker. It's one line out of the Iraq strategy, actually. It's not even in a lot of the counterinsurgency writing. But in essence, that's shorthand for you have to focus on securing and protecting the population and identifying the causes of instability and addressing them rather than chasing the bad guys. So Taliban, let me give you the example of Helmand. Taliban forces in Helmand tend to operate in 3 different modes. There are full-time guerrilla units, what you might call mobile columns that move around from district to district. They're not tied to any particular area, and when security forces move into that area, they just leave. And what's actually happened in Helmand right now is that as the Marines have gone into southern Helmand, the main fighting forces of the Taliban have actually dispersed to tribal cousins in different parts of the country, just east of Helmand and also northwest of Helmand. So when you move into an area with troops, you don't actually destroy the Taliban. All you do is brush them out of the way. That's the clear part, and it's actually the least important part. The next element of the Taliban in a place like Helmand are local village and district insurgent cells. They're not armed fighters. What they are is like a political infrastructure, and they might have a cell of 3 to 5 people in a village or 10 people in a compound who may have some link to the Taliban politically, or they might have some link to the old regime or some tribal alliance with the local Taliban fighter, and those guys essentially act as the eyes and ears. They're there all the time. They intimidate the population. They organise politically. And they gather together resources and intelligence and so on to support the mobile column. When you move into an area, the fighters leave, but the infrastructure stays. And what you then have to do is go and actually clear that infrastructure. And that's a matter of police work, counterintelligence work, and building new structures that can displace those cells. You know, why would people feel safe enough to support the government when there's still someone living in the next compound coming and threatening them every night? So you've got to make people feel safe enough to move away from that. And then the sort of final element of build is it's not enough to go into an area, surge in, push the enemy out of the way, clear out whatever infrastructure you can find, and then something else happens somewhere else and you just leave and go away and leave everybody hanging. If you do that, it actually harms the population rather than helping them. Because as you move into an area and establish security, people sort of come out of the woodwork and start working with you, and those people are then visible, and they can be targeted. And so when you leave, the enemy comes back and they kill those people. And so when you come back in 2 months, 3 months later, you say, where are those people that we worked with last year? They're gone. They're dead now. And the population won't work with you because they saw their neighbours get killed for working with the last coalition unit that was in town. So there's a permanence and continuity effect that has to be in there. The worst thing you can do with counterinsurgency theory is to read the book and just take it as a template and think it's a cookie cutter that you can apply in the same way in different areas. There is no single approach that works. What you have to do is go in and diagnose the specifics of what's actually causing instability in this village or that valley and figure it out by understanding the environment in its own terms, and then diagnose small, local, restrained kinds of programs to deal with those specific sources of instability. Going in with some kind of general cookie cutter approach just can be ultimately counterproductive.
Let me press you on two caveats before I turn to Andrew that were, I think, in that answer. The first is that you have a policing problem, that you have, you go into the district, and to dismantle that infrastructure, as you called it, you need police and intelligence resources, local intelligence resources to do that. It's not evident to me that those are extant in Afghanistan at the moment. That seems like one fairly big caveat. And the second is that you don't have, you have a larger country than Iraq, you have a more populous country than Iraq, and a more inaccessible population than Iraq, and a more, do we actually have the forces necessary to be able to pursue a credible hold strategy?
Yeah, well, let's talk about policing and rule of law in more sort of general terms, because we've all talked around that. When the international community came in 2001, in the Bonn Agreement, the German government was given responsibility for police institutional building, and the Italian government was given responsibility for the justice sector and rule of law. And like the rest of the international community, and this is not solely restricted to those two countries, they started from a top-down perspective by building national institutions in Kabul. So the police created the Germans created a police academy in Kabul, started training senior police officers, establishing a Ministry of Interior structure to support that, and gradually intended to build down and create eventually a local level presence. The Italians, built a Supreme Court building and started training judges and attorneys and writing a law code, and they also started at the top level and thought, yeah, we'll eventually get down to the local level. What the Taliban have done is they've displaced those efforts by coming in directly at the local level. So most of the policing function that is making people feel safe and generating a rule of law at the local level is currently being done by the Taliban. There isn't actually a lot of valid police activity happening from the Afghan National Police, and in fact a lot of what the Afghan National Police have been doing, like other parts of the Afghan government, has been counterproductive in terms of rule of law. So I think we do have a very substantial police reform problem. It's not something we're going to deal with in the next 6 months or so, and primarily that policing function that we're talking about right now on the ground is going to be done by military, Afghan military and coalition military. When I say policing, I don't mean, turning soldiers into police. What I mean is walking the beat, developing relationships with the local population, making people feel safe, dealing with crime and rule of law issues and corruption and all those other things that bother people. In terms of the force level, we just published a thing at the Center for New American Security on Afghan strategy, and the title of that document was Triage. And we said, look, we do not have the forces available to secure the whole country to the level that we need to. What we need to start doing is a fairly ruthless triage to identify where are we, where do we need to be, what's the delta, and how can we really focus on the areas that we have to hold. I'm a big opponent of the mowing the grass strategy, because what actually happens is you go in and you attack the Taliban and then you leave, and then anybody that worked with you or anybody who participated in that gets killed. And so what you're actually doing is destroying the leadership and the human capital in the local society by doing that repetitive raiding mentality. And I've come to the conclusion from doing this a lot in Afghanistan and Iraq that if you are going to secure an area, you have to stay there. And if you can't stay somewhere, it's actually better not to go in there at all, because then at least people who don't support the Taliban can stay alive. But when you go in there and try to bring them all out of the woodwork and then you just leave, it's actually ultimately counterproductive.
Andrew, you have written about the Afghan police, in particular a report 2 years ago about the police called Cops or Robbers, ? One of the concerns that I think you have raised is that, and it was highlighted in one of the quotes that you put up, is that the Afghan security forces, and particularly the Afghan police, are not necessarily favorably viewed by the population. And so does creating more of them help us or hurt us?
I'll add that there's lots of discussions about whether that question mark should be there in the title of the report. Clearly, from my mind, there was no question, but I did want to be able to go back to Afghanistan, so we included the question mark. I think this is a big issue because, again, it's pretty fundamental to, again, the whole bit of our strategy that. And, you know, we've seen in the last week again, the proposals to double the size of the ANA and the ANP. And, you know, I would argue on the ANA, I think that there, you know, could be a case made for that. But on the police, until we see some pretty clear evidence that the reputation and quality of the police has improved, I don't quite see how increasing the numbers of bad police is going to have a positive impact on security. And it seems to me it's quite easy to put money in terms of training, equipping, and getting more numbers. And that's what we've been doing. And we put a lot of money into this, and yet we're not seeing a significant improvement in the reputation and perceptions of the police. I mean, there's been some good reporting out of Helmand out of that recently. Just, you know, we cleared, and the people begged or demanded, don't bring in the police, or else we're going to go back to the Taliban. And I think that that's a pretty, you know, significant concern, and that I would have with the proposal to increase police numbers. I have heard that there's been a big focus on this focus district development of trying to send in teams, bring out the police from a district, send in another team, train that other team of the police officials, and send them back. And there's been, I think, some evidence that in the short term there has been some improvements in the quality of policing in some of these districts where we've had FDD. But there's also some evidence that that effect has not been sustained in some of these areas. And I argued in the paper that in some ways for a top-down approach, but that unless we actually really address leadership issues at the top, at the Ministry of Interior, and have significant reform at the Ministry of Interior level, we're not going to see a positive, I think, improvement in the image of the police. I mean, I think we have in the last year seen some improvements at that level, and I'm hoping that that, you know, pays off. But we have a lot more work to do at the top levels of the police in terms of their reputation.
Well, I mean, let me press you both on that for a minute, because of course this is touted as something of a success story. Hanif Atmar, everybody's favorite minister, has been made Minister of the Interior this year. From meetings that I had in Kabul, the word was really two things. First of all, that he was making efforts to clean up the ministry somewhat, and that security in Kabul had actually improved. But that in some odd ways he was less effective than his predecessor because he is effectively at war with the ministry. He's very concerned about his personal security, and in fighting corruption, he still has an old deputy there that he hasn't been able to get rid of. And so, I don't know, Andrew, and then maybe David, you can say something about the challenge of even when you get a good person in place, if you agree with that assessment, the challenge of actually reforming an Afghan government ministry to be effective in such a critical role.
Well, yeah, no, I think that's a critical issue, and just the minister is not the only issue. We have levels of government higher than ministers where I think a lot of the problem resides. And I think that that's, unless you have political support as a minister from the president to push a reform agenda, then I think there's limits to how much you can push. And I think that's been a fairly consistent problem we've seen over the past several years. And I think maybe something we can come back to later is what I see as a real fundamental gap in our current strategy is that we have a military piece, we have an aid piece, but the political piece we don't have. I don't see a political strategy. I'm not opposed to the idea of a military surge if it's to achieve some political objectives, but we've been counting on the Afghan government to lead on the political side, and I think for a long time there was an assumption that this is our government, we created it, and our interests are the same. I think somewhat belatedly we're coming to the recognition, well, actually, maybe our interests and their interests are not one and the same, but we haven't seen a change in our strategy to reflect that realization. We still have a fundamental part of our strategy that the Afghan government is going to lead on the political piece. But I think there's some evidence that some members of the current elite actually benefit considerably from the maintenance of the status quo. A clean, effective, rule of law abiding government would not be in the interests of some people who are doing actually pretty well out of the current system. And I think that, to me, is probably the fundamental strategic issue in Afghanistan, which I have not seen any answers to, and I don't have them.
David, as my boss, Dan Server, is fond of saying, no one in the United States has ever worked in a Ministry of Interior because we don't have one. And yet I think that the reform of the Ministry of Interior has become a high-level Defense Department priority, flooding in mentors and so on. Is this something we're capable of doing?
I think we let me go back to.
And is the Defense Department the right tool?
Yeah, well, that's a very good point. Let me go back to Bob Comer, who ran the effective civilian program in Vietnam between 1968 and 1972. Wrote a Rand Corporation study called Bureaucracy Does Its Thing in 1972. You can get it online. And he went through in some detail the structural and organizational problems of coordinating a number of programs, including ministry reform and interaction with the government of Vietnam. And he ultimately came to the conclusion, and this is not quite a verbatim quote, but he said something like, no amount of enthusiasm or know-how or dedication by some foreign advisor can make up for lack of political will or lack of human capital on the part of a local partner. And I think that remains fundamental of counterinsurgency. And some of the worst errors of counterinsurgency come about from not recognizing the limits of your own influence and acting in too unrestrained a manner to go in and just start changing things and making them better, instead of saying this is ultimately their structure and we have to work within it. And I see Jeremy Pam in the audience, and he's obviously here at USIP, but he's worked very closely with General Petraeus and others to generate a structure that looks at public finance and at limited and restricted forms of intervention at the sort of middle level of the government as really the most effective mechanisms for changing some of these things. I think we've tended to focus on front offices and branch offices. The front office, the minister and his immediate staff, and the branch office, what's happening down on the ground in the local governance centre. And there has to be a whole structure in between those. And how that structure is and how it works depends on what kind of state you're trying to build. And I don't think we ever sat down and asked ourselves in Afghanistan, what kind of Afghan state are we actually trying to construct here? And is it actually viable in Afghan terms? And is it something the Afghan people will accept? And I think we've sort of ended up in a position where we have ministries that are actually not part of a government in any sense that we would recognise the term of a government. There is no Afghan government like there's an American government. What you have is a series of competing fiefdoms who are owned by political rivals, who rivals with each other and also with the president. And so there's a bunch of people who are essentially exploiting the population, exploiting the economy, exploiting the drug trade, exploiting corruption, and exploiting the presence of instability to further their own personal interests. And that's not a government in any sense. That's just a leech on the Afghan nation, and that's what a lot of people think at the local level, which is why they support the Taliban in a lot of cases. And so I think, as Andrew hinted at, extending the reach of a corrupt Afghan government or teaching bad cops to shoot straight is not going to make things better, it's going to make them worse. And so the fundamental problem right now is governance and government reform. And to do that, we have to make them safe enough that we can get into that. But just making it safe is not going to get us anywhere. We have to take that further to reform of the economy, the government, and a bunch of different social and psychological pathologies in Afghanistan that have come about from 30 years of warfare.
Let me take that issue down to the local level before we go back to the national level. Andrew, you just spent some time in Rozgan province, and which is in the south next to Helmand. And I wonder what you could describe what you found there as far as the Afghan government is concerned. Forgetting about the national level, when you go to Rozgan, what is the Afghan government? What does it look like?
Not very good. Certainly at the top level, the governor's reputation, as is not uncommon in Afghanistan, is terrible. Viewed as taking commissions on many of the contracts, being in partnership with the former governor who eventually, I think, some of the donor community, as in Helmand, demanded that be removed, but still calls a lot of shots from behind the scenes. So, and then a lot of the key ministries are then linked to these individuals. But then some are in competing hands. Then some other tribes, Rozgan is highly divided along tribal lines, are still in the hands of rival tribes. And so as David described, you do have a collection of competing individuals at the department levels in Rozgan. But there was this overriding perception that one tribe, in particular the Popolzais, the president's tribe, were getting inordinately strong, and that shortly after 2002, and when U.S. Special Forces first arrived, John Muhammad Khan, the first governor, was quite skillful in convincing some of the international forces there that Popolzais are part of the good Pashtun, who are from the Durrani link, and the Durranis are pro-government, and the Ghilzais are the pro-Talibs, and they're the bad guys. And so it was quite skillfully able to use that to peripheralize some of the Ghilzai tribal groups who are important in Rozgan. And so the feeling is that they had no choice but then to go to the Taliban to get their base of support in their tribal competitions in Rozgan, and that the problem in Rozgan is much more a tribal dispute than a Taliban or Al-Qaeda, dynamic to it. And it's one group gets its support from the government, so the other tribal faction gets its group from the opposition. So everything there, a lot of the discussions were focused on who is winning and who is losing along tribal lines with our current aid programs and our current governance efforts.
And just to even be a little bit more specific. So you have a governor and presumably some representatives from the line ministries in Kabul. You have district governors. Are those people actually physically in the province? Can they go out to any of the districts? What are they doing?
In Rozgan, again, there's been an effort, again, a population-centric approach is what the Dutch have followed, of trying to consolidate control in 3 districts out of the 7 districts. But in those 3 districts, they estimate 60–70% of the population reside. And in those areas, again, the governor can go, but usually in assisted protection provided by international military forces when he travels outside of the actual district center. And that's the same in Paktia, where I had 4 trips to Paktia in the last year doing field research there, and that's been one of the things that the PRT there has made a big effort on, is how do we connect the government to its people. And so they have a very specific effort of trying to take the governor and get him out of the provincial capital into the districts, meeting with people. So basically in helicopter or in Humvees, they escort him out to some of the districts where he can then engage with the tribal elders. Unfortunately, though, again, he has a rather mixed reputation, so that interaction is not necessarily perceived positively, but that's been a very conscious effort to try to link, but also to facilitate district officials to get into the provincial capital so that their voices can be heard. And one of the issues on the aid side is they create these provincial development, have the provincial development committee to prioritize what are usually these long wish lists of projects that they come up with. And in Paktia, inevitably, 90% of these projects that are prioritized are from Gardez town and its vicinities, and all the surrounding districts ignored because people there aren't there to fight this battle. So they have tried to bring people in to participate in these meetings to get their voices heard. So that's been part of the strategy in terms of connecting government to the people in the districts.
David, as you've described our combined notion, the Afghans, the international community, the notion of what sort of state we were looking to create has put us into something of a conundrum in Afghanistan. Because on paper, Afghanistan is one of the most highly centralized states in the world, and in reality, it's one of the most highly decentralized cultures in the world, geographically, economically, politically. So when we go into areas like Rozgan, as Andrew's talking about, the people who actually we may be able to successfully interact with may have little to nothing to do with the government, local leaders, tribal leaders, and so on. And in fact, there's often this problem that the governor may be somebody who is not a positive influence. So describe how do our forces, when they go into a place, who do they interact with? How do they decide how to interact with somebody? And if it's the governor, then what impact does that have on these tribal relationships? Or if it's not the governor, what impact does that have on our ability to expand the writ of the government?
Yeah, well, I want to take Andrew's point about Uruzgan and expand it to the rest of the country, because I think it's a general pattern across Afghanistan that President Karzai, because he didn't have a political party and he didn't have national level structures to fall back on, tended to fall back on a tribal approach to governance and tended to place tribal allies in positions of authority, or people that he needed to buy off. So people that rose to positions of authority tended to either be enemies who could have hurt Karzai, who he bought off with positions of authority, or tribal allies or people in some way who were not a threat to him. And one of the patterns that we've seen emerge is that in large parts of the south of Afghanistan, that resulted in members of minority tribes gaining positions of authority in local administration. And one of the impacts of that is this is a tribe which may have been suppressed and held down by the other tribes for 150 years. It's finally in a position where it can extract some resources from the state and direct them to its own tribal benefit. It knows it's a temporary phenomenon, so it's doing whatever it can to get that largesse out of the government and distribute it to its own tribal network. And the Taliban have come in and pitched the larger tribes and said, look, you're the majority tribe. You've always been in charge. These upstarts have come in and dispossessed you. We'll work with you and get you back in the game. And that's been the sort of political strategy of the Taliban engaging with tribes in both the south and the east. It's worked differently in the east because tribes are smaller and the terrain restricts what options are open to tribal leaders. And so the Taliban, again, though, have come in and pitched the dispossessed and said, look, this is an unrepresentative government that doesn't govern with your interest at heart. We can work with you to deal with that. One of the things the Taliban have done recently, Mullah Barada, who's right now the military commander of the Taliban in the south, has established an ombudsman, a Taliban sort of complaints board, where if you're unhappy with something that a Taliban unit has done, you can go to this board and complain, and the Taliban will fire the guy, almost literally, who has done something to alienate the population. Now, that is a direct governance challenge to the Afghan government, because what they're saying is we're not corrupt, we're responsive, we will not kill innocent civilians, and if we do kill someone by accident, we're open to dealing with that directly with the population. It's a political action that's striking directly at the heart of what the Afghan government is failing to deliver. And I do think, I agree with Andrew that you've got to have top cover and you've got to have these local institutions grounded in some kind of national framework. But the Taliban are kicking our ass at the local level, and we need to pay more attention to the grassroots, which is where the government comes in contact with the population. And it's where that most interactions with the population and the government are extremely painful to people. I often ask people, if someone stole your bicycle, who would you go to get it back? And they never say the police. In fact, they laugh at the suggestion that they go to the police. They say they just beat us up for bothering them. We go to the Taliban. And what that means is it doesn't matter whether the government can drive into and out of a district. if the local population are going to the Taliban to resolve their problems, the Taliban is the government.
So one of the things that's often said about counterinsurgency is that it's 80% civilian, 20% military. And we certainly aren't matching that. You mentioned 21,000 new troops and 300, I've heard even upwards of 800 civilians. Can you say something, I want to talk to both of you about this idea of a civilian surge and what it actually means at the local level. Who are these people? What are they going to be doing? How is a 32-year-old lawyer from Kansas going to improve the rule of law in Helmand province? I'll start with you, Andrew.
As you probably figured out, I'm in the less is more camp in terms of what we're doing in Afghanistan. Although not necessarily in terms of the military surge, as I said, if it's feeding into a political strategy. The civilian surge, though, I'm a lot more dubious about. For one, I don't think we're finding the civilians, so it looks like it might be non-civilians, so I don't know the latest on that. But there's two ways of looking at the problem in Afghanistan is that, one is that we've not done enough, therefore let's send more people there to solve the problem. And I think my concern with that strategy, especially on the civilian side, is already with the civilians we have, they're extremely constrained working in, say, a PRT like in Paktia. You have one State Department person there. Until recently, no Foreign Service national with them, but that's been in the last year. They now have a FSN there as well.
By that you mean an Afghan?
An Afghan, yeah. And they cannot go out without military escort, and that requires a lot of arranging and doing. A lot of Afghans who are important don't necessarily want to come into the PRT to talk to people. So a lot of constraints on what they can do. It's not really clear to me, and no one's really been able to explain what, say, 3 or 4 more State Department people at that PRT would be able to do. And now there's some talk about getting them out more to the district level, but without the language skills, without cultural knowledge, on short-term tenures, without good Afghan counterparts, I mean, a whole range of things, it's still, no one can really describe to me what all these people are going to do. I mean, it could be, worst case scenario, is that a small piece of turf will be further divided and fought over between 4 people rather than just having the one person there. So I'm a bit concerned. But even a more fundamental concern is actually maybe they'll be really successful and actually start doing lots of things. But the more we start doing at that level, the more we take ownership of the problem. And I'm quite skeptical about our capacity to transform the nature of the Afghan government and how it's currently functioning. We've created a lot of the shell of a modern state, but it's still internally operating very much along traditional personalized patronage basis. And at the subnational level, I could see, some people doing good things. I mean, I was a bit alarmed to hear, comments like, what we really need is an American governor in this province for 3 years to sort of put things in order. Or if we could just take over the justice system, because that's really fundamental, and I certainly agree, but if we could just run that for a few years and put that in order. Now, these aren't serious proposals, but it expresses the frustration of many people working at that level who recognize what some of the key issues are and are not making any headway in their 8 or 9 month tour in addressing them, so just want to do it themselves. And I think that's a real danger, that the more people we have, and if they're effective doing more, the more we take ownership of the problem.
David, do you have a best case example of how the civilian uplift would succeed?
No, I think I agree generally with Andrew about the concerns. I think that we need to be extremely restrained and extremely aware of the limits of our own ability to influence the situation, and also be aware that issues like elite capture or the creation of alternative structures that suck the legitimacy out of the Afghan social structure is a very real risk when you bring these kinds of organizations in. I had a guy from a PRT say to me, this PRT has become the economic engine of the province. like that was a good thing. I'm like, well, no, that's a bad thing, man. Because you've actually taken a lot of the legitimacy out of existing organisations. Let me answer your question by telling you a very brief story. Back in 2005, 2006, we were running a project to deliver micro hydro plants to Afghan villages, and they're great little devices. Look like a sort of motor mower. They run a turbine, and you run water through them, and they can generate enough light to light 1 or 2 streets of the village. And the program was totally failing. It was run with 70 Afghans in a factory in Afghanistan, in Kabul. We would build these things, and then we would take them out and deliver them as a gift from the American people to Afghan villages. And they'd have even a big sticker on the side, gift to the American people. And we would get there, and the Afghans would be like, well, whose land is this going to go on? Because they won't be able to grow crops anymore. And whose water is going to be diverted from their crops to run this turbine? And you know what? There's only 2 streets worth of lighting here, but there's 5 streets in the village, so who misses out? So we'd have to answer and deal with all those local problems in order to just give them this thing we were trying to give them. But the metrics that the guys had been given was you've got to give these things away. So they were out there giving them away to villages. Typically they would last in position 2 to 4 weeks, because once they're out on the ground, they become a symbol of the government, a symbol of the international community, but we're not out there to protect them. So the Taliban would come along and blow them up. And eventually the Taliban got smarter than that, and instead of blowing them up, they would just come along and steal them. And the population would then come and say, someone stole your hydro plant, give us another one. And we would have to, because they've had light for 2 weeks, they're now back in darkness, you don't give them another one, they hate you. So we were actually providing hydroelectric power to the Taliban. And when we first went into Nuristan at the end of 2006, we moved into areas that we'd never been in before, and we found our hydro plants running Taliban base areas. So this is a total failure. The way that it was resolved was by just getting the hell out of the way. And instead of having it as a gift to the American people, just making it a straight commercial project. And we set the price of these things at such a level that an individual couldn't afford them, but a village could. And then we just advertised them and said, if you want one of these things, you buy it. And there's a good factory that builds them, and just, you want one, go get it. And so what they would have to do is put a bunch of investors together in the village and get the money together, drive all the way to Kabul, pick this thing up, get it back across the bad roads, and then those people would have to answer all these questions about whose water gets used and where the land is and so on. And so what you have is the beginnings of local government, with local investors, local important people in the village solving community problems together. Then they build the thing, and it's theirs, it's not ours. So if the Taliban come along and blow it up, they don't come to us and say, give us a new one. They get angry at the Taliban and go fight them, which is a good result from a counterinsurgency standpoint. So intervening in a very low-key way, further upstream, in a way that doesn't have a direct impact on the population, rather than getting in directly and trying to do things for them, in that one case seems to have been the right approach. And I think you can take that and generalise from that to say that a limited number of carefully selected interventions can have a lot more impact than putting a bunch of bozos on the ground who just don't know that much about Afghanistan, and they're there for 6 months, and they're just there to spend the budget. And I think we've got to be really careful of not falling into that latter trap as we go through this process.
One other anecdote just to add to that is that, again, in Paktia, I think we had an excellent PRT team there the last 9 months, and really committed, working hard, and very well informed in terms of some of what they're doing. But they were also struggling with how do we put an Afghan government face on what we're doing, and as I described, took them out to the provinces. But they also thought, well, it'd be good to involve him in some of the contracting processes. So they would shortlist the contracts, and then the last 5 they would sort of present to him, to have a say. But of course, that then just fueled lots of speculation that the governor's now getting a cut on all these, and whether he was or not, I don't know, but that was the perception. So in some ways, it further delegitimized the reputation of the governor. And then when I go to the governor's office to meet, we still have every movable object in the office has a big USAID sticker on it, showing this, and to what extent is that like, legitimizing the perceptions of the government? So I think we still have some relics of the past in terms of our aid policies and procedures, which is to some ways I think are counterproductive.
Let me segue to this question of perceptions, because obviously a lot of this ultimately hinges on the perceptions of the Afghan population. And there are three things that I want to throw out that I'd like you guys to respond to as far as perceptions are concerned. One is there is a perception that has been around for a while that the military coalition is essentially in Afghanistan is an anti-Pashtun coalition. All the fighting is against Pashtuns, and then there's this trope, apart from Karzai, that there are no Pashtuns in the government. You often hear this, despite whatever the reality may be, that a lot of the positions in the cabinet clearly are Pashtun. The second perception, which I always find fascinating, is that the U.S. is in league with the Taliban. And this comes from a sense, one, that the U.S. is the lone superpower in the world. How could we possibly, after 8 years, be failing to deal with these yahoos? The other, I think, deeper perception is that the U.S., particularly under Musharraf, but also historically, has always been such a deep supporter of Pakistan and the Pakistan military establishment. The Pakistan military establishment is clearly the supporter of the Taliban. So ipso facto, we support the Taliban. And then the third one is this question, obviously, of civilian casualties. The Taliban certainly, I think last year, almost evenly, if not somewhat more so, kills many civilians as the U.S. forces, international forces do. But in part fueled by politics in Afghanistan, there is this perception that the U.S. is killing a lot of Afghans in its efforts to fight the Taliban. All of these perceptions add up to a pretty bad picture, in addition to the aid problems that you've pointed out, of what the international community is actually trying to do. And so it looks like we're either nefarious and corrupt or incompetent in the eyes of a lot of Afghans. How do we deal with this perception problem? I mean, everybody who writes about counterinsurgency, you, David included, has written about the fundamental importance of information operations, et cetera, et cetera. How do we deal with this problem?
That's a tough one, because I think, that, again, in the research we've been doing, we've been looking what are the perceptions of insecurity, and top amongst them are the perceptions that we're part of the security problem, and how we disrespect the culture and the traditions and the civilian casualties. The ethnic issue comes out very strongly, and in terms of the need in the counterinsurgency to address the sources of frustration of the local communities, some of these things I don't quite know how you do. Certainly in Paktia, the ethnic thing comes out extremely strongly, and you really get a fundamental grievance is the perception that the Pashtun overall have lost out. Historically, they were extremely dominant, and now they're just dominant in terms of. But the perception in Paktia is that they've lost out. Northern Alliance captured the Kabul government. They control the intelligence. They really control the ANA. They certainly controlled the police, and so the key institutions of the state are now controlled by non-Pashtun, and so that comes out very strongly. Also, in Paktia, very much that Paktia has lost out. We were the former kingmakers of Afghanistan. We brought Nader Khan to the throne, and now there's no one from Paktia in the cabinet, and this is a great insult to us, and we used to have all these special deals from the government. So a lot of those sense of the grievances, but the ethnic thing came out very strongly, and I think that's not an issue for which there's an easy solution. Over the past 30 years, the Pashtun have lost ground in terms of control in Afghanistan. Certainly when we do the research in the north, the perception is that the Pashtuns still run the show and have too much power. But how do you address that issue? And the perceptions are so different across the ethnic divide there. In terms of the civilian casualty issue, that it's very encouraging to see a lot of attention to that issue in the last 6 months. But I sort of only wonder, why did it take so long? Because it just came out again and again and again in the interviews. The perception again that we are part of the security problem in terms of our behavior and the disrespect for the culture. And this year, early on, last December, January, there's some particularly unfortunate incidents in Khost, and that I think did have an impact on a lot of the perceptions and some of the interviewing we were doing in Paktia, but very real. And certainly, you hear it again and again that we are actually backing the Taliban. And, that's, again, because people saw in the aftermath of 9/11, in a space of 3 weeks, the U.S. Pretty much defeat the Taliban through very impressive use of air power, very surgical strikes. I used to be the Save the Children director at the time, and we had an office in Kabul, and we had quite a few Arab groups housed in the neighborhood where we were, and you went in afterwards, and some of these houses were very precisely taken out, and neighboring ones not. So I think people saw this and now sort of wonder, why can the Taliban roam freely and get away with it? So it does fuel some of these conspiracy theories.
Do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think one of the fundamental problems we've had in Afghanistan is we haven't taken Afghan opinion seriously enough. When you're fighting in a counterinsurgency environment, it doesn't matter if you actually make the people safe. They have to feel safe before they'll be willing to put the weapon down and turn to work with the government. So it's not like perceptions are the most important thing. Perceptions are the only thing. It's a political competition, and people have to believe that they're better off with the government and better off with what you're trying to do than with the enemy. Otherwise, they will not stop supporting the enemy. And so it's all about achieving that perception shift. But we have typically not done that. So as an example, there was a rumor about 12 months ago that the British were actually setting up a Taliban training camp in Helmand, okay? And we were all like, that's just laughable. It's so far-fetched. How can anybody possibly believe that? That's true, but it doesn't matter. Yes, it's far-fetched. Of course no one's setting up a Taliban training camp, but if the population believe that you are, then that's the problem that you've got to deal with. And that's the same problem that you have in a lot of cases in counterinsurgency. And I would also point to another sort of conceptual error, which is the idea that if you make people like you, they will stop supporting the enemy. And it doesn't work like that. You can go in and give people all kinds of benefits. When the sun goes down and the Taliban come and put a gun to their head and say, who do you support? They'll say, I support you. So really, it's about protecting people and making them feel safe and giving them a sense of order, almost a normative system where they know if I stay within these boundaries, I'll be safe. That's what the Taliban provides, and we need to provide something equally ordered to make people turn away from supporting the Taliban. One of the best studies on this stuff is by a guy called Stathis Kalivas, called The Logic of Violence in Civil War, where he talks about how a lot of people think that where the population likes the enemy, that's where the enemy becomes strong. But actually, he goes through an exhaustive series of field research examples to show that, in fact, the opposite is the case. Where the enemy is strong, people start liking them because they can protect them. And the same's true for us. You've got to get in there and make people feel safe, and you've got to protect them from all comers, including their own government and their own police and the warlords and the drug traffickers and everybody. Otherwise, you really have no chance to get them to turn.
Let me segue to the second part of that, of the supporting the Taliban point, which is Pakistan. It appears as though the Taliban continues after 8 years to not only have but to enjoy sanctuary in Pakistan. There's not a lot of evidence, despite what Pakistan is now doing in its own conflict with Pakistani extremists, that there has been any amount of significant pressure to deal with the base of the leadership of the Afghan Taliban in Pakistan. Simply put, David, is there any way that we can win a counterinsurgency in Afghanistan if the Taliban can run across the border and we can't?
If there were no Pakistan and it was just the coastline of Afghanistan, there would still be an insurgency inside Afghanistan, and if Pakistan were to go away tomorrow, we would still have a lot of internally generated problems to deal with. But the presence of that sanctuary and safe haven on the east and south of the country really makes it extremely difficult to deal with the insurgency. We're also in a position where, as you correctly pointed out, certain elements, problems that Richard Holbrooke is struggling with in terms of regional diplomacy, or how do you do that? For us running the campaign in Afghanistan, I think we can make a very substantial improvement on the ground, even if not much changes in Pakistan. But I think the danger is that while we're making some progress in Afghanistan, Pakistan will keep getting worse and worse, to the point where ultimately, the problems emanating out of Pakistan dwarf anything that we might have seen from a Taliban takeover in Afghanistan.
Andrew, you've spent an awful long time thinking about Pakistani politics. Do you see the potential for change within the civilian and probably especially the military and ISI leadership vis-a-vis their relation to the Taliban? Is it possible that somehow, whether it's through negotiation or otherwise, that they will come around to a position of not supporting the Taliban?
I guess anything is possible, but I don't see it as likely. I mean, if they haven't done it yet, what's going to change to make them do it in the future again? I think what has changed in Pakistan, and I think it's very significant, is in the last few months that the Pakistan population has certainly turned against the Pakistani Taliban. And before, I think there was less of a distinction made, and I think there's lots of anti-American sentiment in Pakistan. And so the perception that the Taliban were primarily fighting infidels in Afghanistan was actually quite popular, and there was, I think, some popular support. I think that in the public mind, that line is getting blurred to some extent, as the Pakistani Taliban, somewhat inexplicably, as far as I can tell, turned to sort of mass terrorism and doing rather silly things like attacking the Sri Lankan cricket team, which is not a way to win hearts and minds in Pakistan. I think has lost a lot of support, and I think that does create some potential for some change in policy. Certainly, it was the military, I think, did use that to regain some legitimacy to go after the Pakistani Taliban. But in terms of policies on the Afghan Taliban, I don't see, again, as you pointed out, any change, and I'm not clear how we're going to, in their strategic interests in terms of the regional perceptions and what they perceive as the growing role of India in Afghanistan. The Taliban are still viewed as a strategic asset, and I don't think one that they're going to give away easily.
So USIP just published a book by Michael Semple, who you know well, called Reconciliation in Afghanistan. And one of the things that, of course, is on everybody's mind is the potential to negotiate with the Taliban. Is there a political way out of this? And Pakistan is potentially seen as one of the keys to that. Are there, this is first to you, Andrew, are there fruitful negotiations to be had with the Afghan Taliban leadership, and is Pakistan potentially the key to being able to bring them to the table?
I actually think the key is the Afghan government, and as I said before, I think that's where part of the problem lies. I think that's, to be successful in Afghanistan, however we want to determine success, that reconciliation process is critical. I mean, there isn't a military solution, and there's not a reconstruction solution. It has to be political. We have to engage, and that's why, again, if our military surge is to promote that, I'm supportive of that. But I think the Afghan government has a critical role to play, and I think for a lot of the current cast of characters, what is there to be gained for them in terms of reconciliation? What's in their interests? They're actually, again, doing quite well with the status quo. I think when you put someone like Mr. Mojaddedi as in charge of your sort of peace and reconciliation process, I sort of interpret that as an indication you're not terribly serious. So I would still say that in terms of the Afghan Taliban, that process, I think Pakistan can play a role in that, but as I said, I don't think that I see their interest changing. I think the Afghan government plays a critical role in taking a leadership role in that reconciliation process.
David, I'm interested in your reaction to that, but with an additional question of timing. Is it fruitful for the United States right now to be even putting out there the idea, given the current military reality on the ground, political reality, to be putting forward the idea of negotiating with the Taliban?
Well, the short answer is no, but let me expand a little bit. The vast majority of successful counterinsurgency campaigns in history have been won through negotiating with the enemy. It's extremely rare historically to find a government that's successfully destroyed an insurgency. In almost every successful case, what happens is the insurgents are fought to a point where they feel like their best interests are served by striking a deal with the government, and then they resolve their differences. And probably the classic example in recent times of a successful negotiation is the British government in Northern Ireland with the so-called Good Friday Accords, which, if you look at the historical examples of successful negotiation with insurgencies, they basically fall into a similar sort of category of what the British government did, where the essential deal is you put down the weapon and give up the armed struggle, and in return you can have a seat at the table as part of the political process. And that most successful negotiations with insurgent movements are that kind of deal. The insurgents agree to stop fighting in return for participation in unarmed politics. That's not where we're at in Afghanistan, nowhere close to that. And you just have to look at the failure of last year's attempt to negotiate in Saudi Arabia, where the two sides were negotiating from completely cross purposes. The Afghan government was negotiating to get the Taliban to lay down their weapons and rejoin the fold. The Taliban were negotiating for recognition of their gains and the departure of all foreigners from Afghanistan. So they were completely incompatible negotiating platforms. So I think what we actually have to do before any kind of negotiation becomes a viable approach is to convince the Taliban that they're not going to win by continuing to fight. And that means we have to fight them. We've got to actually get out there and secure the population, displace the Taliban, bring better governance, and show them that they can't achieve their aims through insurgency. Then the other issue is it depends on what you mean by Taliban. If you're talking about negotiating with the Quetta Shura, I think we're not ready to do that at this point. But then there are a lot of local groups who are fighting alongside the Taliban who, don't necessarily partake of that ideology or don't necessarily support the Quetta Shura, who could be brought over to our side in the short term for local reasons. And I use one example. I sat down with Mullah Salam, the recently defected Taliban leader from Musa Qala district in about March last year. And one of the questions that was asked of him in this discussion was, what made you decide to leave the Taliban and come over to the side of the government? And he said, no, you don't understand. I wasn't with the Taliban before, and I'm not with the government now. What I'm doing is looking after my people. And I've decided that our interests are best served right now by working with you guys. And that could change. And that's how a lot of these guys are. Any guy who's still alive, running a tribe or a district at this point after 30 years of warfare in Afghanistan is adept at surviving, making deals, identifying the prevailing wind, all that sort of stuff. We have to become the prevailing wind before we're going to be able to negotiate with people.
Before I give a few people in the audience a crack at you, one more question. The big thing on everybody's mind, of course, August 20th, national elections. And the question I really want to ask from both of you is, can we succeed with President Karzai for another 5 years? I think that the biggest fear for Afghanistan is, as I think you said earlier, David, that we end up with President Karzai for another 5 years as an increasingly illegitimate figure, and with a troop surge and every other kind of surge, a Holbrooke surge, and so on, we end up owning Afghanistan and propping up an illegitimate Afghan government in a way that hasn't been true to date, and frankly, to draw the parallel again, starts to look maybe somewhat more like Vietnam. I was reading a profile recently of President Thieu describing his regime as corrupt and indecisive with the support of 500,000 U.S. troops, billions of dollars, and 1 million South Vietnamese forces. So, can we afford another 5 years with Karzai? And if Karzai does win, what needs to change in order for us not to fall into that very dangerous trap?
Yeah, look, this is we're in a bit of a dilemma here, and to pick up on your Vietnam analogy, and I'm not sure how familiar too many people are with the history of Vietnam, but Karzai to me looks a little bit like President Diem in 1963. He has a reasonably clean personal reputation, but he's seen as ineffective. His family are corrupt. He's alienated a very substantial portion of the population by favouring another portion of the population. He's seen as paranoid and delusional and out of touch with reality. That's all the sorts of things that were said about President Diem in 1963. And as you know, the US connived at his overthrow and assassination and ended up owning the problem. And no Vietnamese government for 6 years after the overthrow of Diem lasted more than about 18 months. And there was this continuous instability, and we ended up owning that problem and having to deal with it ourselves. Right now, for all of his faults, Afghans know that they elected Karzai, that it was a legitimate election in 2004 that led to these last 5 years. They may be unhappy, but it's not our we don't own the problem. As soon as we prop the guy up and become the arbiters of power in Afghanistan, it's fundamentally our problem. I think it's kind of academic. I think my judgment is that Karzai is going to win the election. Abdullah or Ashraf might force him to a second vote, a second runoff, but I think it's unlikely that he's going to lose, given his control of all the levers of state power. It's highly unlikely. If I were a Taliban commander, I wouldn't be disrupting the election by attacking the polling booth on election day. Doesn't make a lot of tactical sense. It's a known location, it's a known day and known time, it's a daylight attack. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. What you do is let the unpopular guy get re-elected and then go pitch the population afterwards and say, that was pretty terrible, wasn't it? Do you think you can stand another 5 years of this? And use that as a political rallying cry to mobilise the population afterward. I think that may be the sort of political strategy we see out of the Taliban.
Andrew, any thoughts about the election? And despite what David said, and maybe you agree with Karzai's inevitable victory, but will President Abdullah change things to the positive, or would that cause an ethnic conflagration?
Well, I certainly don't agree that anything is inevitable. And I think that the more we talk about inevitability, in a way that becomes a bit self-fulfilling. In Afghanistan, everyone thinks the election is decided in this town, not in Afghanistan. And I think that the speculation in the press that senior policymakers are saying that this is inevitable really took the wind out of the sails out of the opposition movement. When I was there in January, there was a lot of excitement because there was a perception the Obama administration doesn't like Karzai, and the opposition people were invited to the inauguration, and Joe Biden walked out at dinner and all this kind of thing. Then by March, when I was there, the first article in The Guardian appeared about how, well, we had decided Karzai is going to win, so now we want a prime minister, and then it became a CEO, and that really took the wind out of the opposition sails. So I think that perception thing is important. And I think some of the things that Ambassador Eikenberry did by actually going to some of the opposition press conferences, although controversial, did help reverse some of that perception. And I think that's actually turned it into a bit of a race. And I think the tone of the coverage in the last few weeks has changed considerably. That said, I mean, it's hard to know, it's hard to paint a positive picture coming out of it, because I think, either we're going to have lots of insecurity, then low turnout maybe in some areas, but that could be overcompensated by massive rigging in other areas. One thing is that if everyone thinks Karzai is going to win, and you also have lots of apathy and everyone assumes it's going to be rigged, if indeed Karzai wins and there's lots of rigging, people will just say, well, that's what we expected anyway, so you might not see disturbances. Maybe that's the best case scenario. On the other hand, I think you could see, and certainly we saw this in the 2005 parliamentary elections. The elections themselves, election day, went relatively well, although there was significant rigging in the southeast in particular. But the real controversy emerged during the counting process, and I think the post-election period will be, again, particularly tricky. In terms of, I'm sort of dodging your question a bit in terms of President Abdullah, I think if President Karzai was reelected, I mean, I think that, I think it's time for the international community to demand more in return for international assistance. I'm generally not a big fan of conditionalities. They're often not effective. But I don't think we have a lot of options, and we're paying a lot in Afghanistan now in terms of blood and treasure, and I think that we have not been very strong in terms of demanding from President Karzai certain reforms that are in our interests, possibly not in his interests. And I think I'm not necessarily optimistic that that will be successful. I admittedly am grasping at straws, but I think that if Karzai is reelected, we do need something to fundamentally alter the way the governance piece is currently being done. And massive USAID programs or donor assistance programs dealing on the technical margins of that, I think, are not going to be the solution. I think it's a fundamental political will issue where we need to push harder, I think, than we have to date on that. And we need to change the incentive structures where currently, as I said, lots of people are doing extremely well out of the status quo. And somehow, and I think our aid program is a significant player in that. Lots of the current senior leadership have their own construction companies, are involved in this, and are benefiting from this current system. And somehow maybe we could be more smart on the political economy of our aid programs to try to push for some change as well.
Great. We have time for a few questions from the audience. We have a roving microphone, so just stay seated and raise your hand, and I'll recognize people to ask questions. The gentleman standing.
Thank you. Gareth Porter. I'm an independent investigative journalist and historian. First of all, I want to applaud Alexander Tyr and the panelists for certainly the most thoughtful presentation on Afghanistan that I've seen in this town since this war began. You've given us, I think, really a large, massive dose of realism compared with what has been the public discourse on this subject in the recent past. Unfortunately, the massive realism, it seems to me, presents us with a major question, which is what is it that really convinces either of the panelists, if I can ask both of you, that the United States should persist in this effort? I mean, it seems to me you've made a very strong case, both of you, that we don't have the answer for governance reform, that what we have here is not really a government, but a congeries of warlord or tribal interests who have really captured power in a highly unusual situation of really anarchy in a way. And without having a key to the kind of reform that would be necessary to change this, why should the United States persist in this effort? Isn't this a formula really to persist under these circumstances for perpetual war without being able to really offer the Afghan people a solution, a peace, really? Thank you.
Powerful question. David, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, this is the key question, and I think what I would say is, and I'm going to again be completely frank about this, I think that what the President said on the 27th of March about how we need to do this so that Al-Qaeda doesn't reestablish itself in Afghanistan, I think that maybe is in the mix of why we need to be there, but I wouldn't certainly put that at the top of my list. I think that there are probably four main reasons for persisting in Afghanistan. I want to talk about those, then talk about what I mean by persisting. The first one is, we have a moral and legal obligation to the Afghan population based on a series of international agreements, the Bonn Agreement, the London Compact, the Tokyo meeting that just happened. 42 countries are there. The international community has committed a very substantial amount of effort to getting this right. And a lot of Afghans have trusted us and have participated in this process, and we have an obligation to see it through. And I think, it's very convenient to walk away from some of these moral obligations when they become difficult, and sometimes you do have to do that. But, let's just remember that we've repeatedly made commitments to the Afghan population. The second reason, and this is a purely political thing, is I think that NATO as an alliance would be extremely severely weakened by failure in Afghanistan. And I think Americans and other members of NATO need to take that as very seriously as a potential risk. If we were to fail in this effort, which is the first time that NATO's ever really operated in a large-scale out-of area, and it's really the first real war that NATO's ever been involved in, if we fail in that enterprise, I think the future of NATO becomes very, very questionable. I think the third reason is the effect on Pakistan of a collapse in Afghanistan would be very significant also. We have a very strong insurgent movement inside Afghanistan, which would then become available to target Pakistan. And I think the fall of Pakistan would rapidly follow the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban. And, you've got 100 nuclear weapons there and Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda senior leadership in Pakistan. So I think that's a very severe downside to failure. And then the final one would be terrorism. That there is a link to the presence of terrorists in South Asia, which has been part of a lot of international terrorism over the last decade or so, and we are really trying to deal with that. So I think we need to persist, but let me tell you what I mean by persist. I think we need to put some pretty significant limits on how much we're prepared to spend, how many troops we're prepared to send, and how long we're going to do this for. Now let me paint for you a best case scenario. We will probably look at 1 to 2 years minimum of heavy fighting ahead of us in order to stabilise the situation as it currently stands. If that works, then we're probably looking at about 3 years of handover to robust Afghan forces that we'll have to build between now and then. If that works, so that's 2 ifs now, if that works, we're probably then in about another 5 years of overwatch, where we're basically keeping the enemy off the back of the new Afghan structure while it gets strong enough to operate on its own. That's 10 years, but it's not 10 years of fighting, it's about 2 years of heavy fighting. And I don't think we're going to fight for 10 years. We'll fight for 2 years and then successfully transition, or we'll fight for 2 years and we'll lose and we'll go home. So I think we're looking at about 2 more fighting seasons in Afghanistan, and about, I think that we have slightly underdone the resources, but I think we need to be very careful about going too much more than what we've got in there now. For 2 reasons. Firstly, we need those resources elsewhere. And secondly, 80 to 90% of what we have in Afghanistan comes through Pakistan. And we're very vulnerable. The more troops and equipment and resources we put into Afghanistan, the more vulnerable we become to interdiction of that line of communication.
Andrew?
I admit to being conflicted on this issue. I am quite pessimistic about our chances for success. However, I'm not ready to concede defeat yet. I do think that there are some positive things. One is a much greater recognition that we have a serious problem. I think that's the first step towards trying to address it. Certainly when I was running AREU in Kabul from like 2002 to 2005, and then subsequently when I came to Washington to do briefings, there was no appetite for bad news. Afghanistan was our success story, Iraq was the bad war, and if you raised any questions during that period in this town, I'm slightly exaggerating, but generally eyes would glaze over and you would get written off as a naysayer, and that word was used to describe me on several occasions. I think that those people now, as we can see from the audience here, I think there is now a recognition we have some serious problems, and I think there is a very concerted effort to address it. And so I'm certainly would be supportive of let's do that, let's have the troop surge, and let's link that to a political strategy along with concerted effort to pressure whoever is elected and a new government in Afghanistan to also push for a political resolution to the conflict. So I think that's the only prospect I think we're going to have to be able to leave somewhat successfully.
A young lady in the back here, Dipali.
Dipali Mukhopadhyay, PhD student at the Fletcher School. There seem to be 2 competing arguments that come out in this discussion about governance. One is that better governance is critical in order to win the population back. The second argument being that the international community isn't really capable or prepared to intervene effectively in terms of governance at the district and provincial and national level, or at least we don't have evidence of that. How can those 2 arguments be reconciled into something of a governance strategy or a political strategy in the coming years?
Well, I think they can be. I'm not sure they will be. But I think the approach that this analysis suggests is that governance reform matters a lot more than governance extension, and improvements in the sort of anti-corruption, governance oversight, rule of law, those sorts of aspects become the linking element between security and reconstruction. So that if you imagine development as one end of a bridge and security as another, and you're trying to build them towards the middle, the only way you're going to get them to link up is through some viable governance structure that makes the population feel safe and believe that the development initiatives will be ultimately used to benefit them. So I think it's primarily governance reform of Afghan structures, ideally led by Afghans, but if not led by them, then prompted by our willingness to say, you know what, we're not going to keep propping this thing up forever, and we're going to intervene in the areas where we see benefit, but we're not going to assume responsibility for the whole problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd come back to something David mentioned earlier. I do think we do have a contradiction, and it relates to this lack of vision of the state. We don't really have a clear sense of what our political objective is and governance objective is in Afghanistan, and that's one reason why I think it's not surprising we haven't made too much headway. We have a lot of competing donor-led initiatives on the governance front. Initially, all the focus is on Kabul and very little at the subnational level. Currently, subnational is the flavor of the year, and so we're getting a lot of focus on subnational. Let's give up on the center. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but I think there's a lot of contradictions. Do we want the formal? Do we want the informal? And I think, I think we need to try to become clear, at least in our own minds, of what is the vision of the state that we would like to try to achieve in Afghanistan.
Len, right next to you.
Len Rubenstein, I'm a fellow here at USIP. This is a question for Andrew about your presentation on aid. It's generally recognized that the civilian health programs in Afghanistan have been very successful. The programs run by USAID, AID, World Bank, and the Europeans, putting aside the PRT and the commander programs, and that they've lowered deaths and improved health indicators significantly. The question is, what is your view of that perception, and what is your view beyond that of how Afghans perceive the improvement in the civilian health system based on the aid intervention?
I certainly agree. Health, I think, is one of the real big success stories in Afghanistan, and we've seen very significant, quantifiable, evidence-based improvements, unlike in many of the other areas. So, no, I would certainly acknowledge that. I think partly because it's probably one of the most depoliticized sectors, and you also had a cadre of Afghan professionals in the health sector. But early on, a strategy to sort of contract out health sector was adopted, where the ministry would mostly have a policy-setting role, but the actual implementation was contracted out. And for once, some of the major donors, including the World Bank, USAID, and the EU, sort of agreed on a common strategy for health sector nationally. And it was not driven by, security considerations. Let's just focus on the South, as in, we're seeing in some of the other sectors. So again, a real success story. However, the perception amongst Afghans is, why don't we have more hospitals? And clearly, Afghanistan is not a country that can afford a highly hospital-intensive health structure, but that is a bit of a legacy of the Soviet period. There's and even prior to that, a focus on urban, hospital-based health delivery, and pretty much ignored the rural areas. And a real success story now is lots better health delivery in the rural areas, but it's often primary health care-based models, and you go into people and they want a hospital. And we're not giving them a hospital. We're telling them, to wash their hands after they go to the toilet, and basic health education methods. And I think that's where the expectations are much higher. They want ultrasound machines at the district level. And so I think that perceptions issue is very hard to beat with our aid programs. But I think we shouldn't let that, lead to us to change what is one of our few real success stories in Afghanistan in the development sector.
I'm going to take a couple of questions to bunch them up at the end and give you guys a last couple minutes to respond. First one up here.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the panel for their insights today. My name is Naveed Bandali. I'm with IPOA. We're the Association of the Stability Operations Industry. And I'd like to hear their perspective on how the private sector can better support stability operations in Afghanistan.
Okay. Jerry in the back there.
Thank you. Also, thank you for the panel, a great panel and real reality, as someone earlier said. I guess to me the question is, given the your analysis about the fighting fiefdoms, the rent-seeking, the political control for personal gain, etc. What's the leverage to gain the reforms after the elections? How do you? What's the ability, especially if we have all these moral and other kind of commitments? What's the leverage to make that happen?
And last question from our own Sarah Thrall, who, in addition to asking a question, is responsible for the organization of this event. So special thanks to her. Go ahead.
Thanks. Just to tie it up, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, you've given us an idea of how we've gotten where we are, but what is a realistic expectation for what success means? What degree of corruption, of lack of justice, of insurgency? You know, Dr. Kilcullen, you gave that 10-year time frame. So what does that look like? What's the outcome?
So about 2.5 minutes to each of you to pick and choose whatever you want to say, didn't get to say, jokes, anything to wrap this up.
Well, I mean, private sector, I think, has an extremely important role, and I would include civil society organizations, NGOs, and humanitarian organizations in that, not just for-profit organizations. I think there's some very significant limits on what foreign governments can do in somebody else's country. So to the extent that you have local buy-in, local ownership on projects, and a real dialogue with the population that gets back to that original partnership from 2001, that's where I think we can see a very significant improvement. And the private sector's got to be a key part of that, because government officials, hunker down in fobs can't do that for you. Second thing is how do we establish leverage? Well, we do have limited leverage, and we need to not overstress the leverage that we do have. But I think one of the areas that we have is we do now have a significant number of troops in the areas where the fighting is heaviest. And the partnership model, where you always have an Afghan unit with a coalition unit with an Afghan police unit, allows you to break some of the corruption patterns. So one of the things you can say is, right, well, we're working with this Afghan police unit. We will never go out without an Afghan police patrol, and the Afghan police will never operate without an Afghan military and a coalition military presence in the area where they're operating. And so as a corrupt drug lord, you can buy off the police chief, but you can't buy off some coalition commander who's rotating in and out. And the Afghan army guy will stand there and say, why did you just beat that old lady up? And why did you take money from that guy? And it creates a monitoring and enforcement effect. We've had a lot of success with that in the parts of Afghanistan where we've tried it. And I think we need to look at expanding that into the areas where we have a lot of troop presence. And the final thing is define success. I'm not going to give you like a specific set of indicators, but ultimately what we need to be doing here is not defeating the Taliban, but building an Afghan state that can handle the Taliban. And that could take 5 to 10 years, but Afghanistan doesn't just face an insurgency, it faces a wide variety of internal and external problems, and we'll be there forever if we try and solve those problems for them. What we need to do is just get the threat down to the level where locals can handle it, and then, you know what, they handle it. And it could take 10 more years, that's okay.
Andrew?
Yeah, on the private sector, I think when I was in Kabul in July, I met with one of the CEOs of one of the main private sector investors in Afghanistan, and who early on set up some very successful businesses, and basically said that today they could no longer do it, that the economy is too criminalized now for someone who wants to basically play by the rules to invest and succeed in the current Afghanistan context. So I think that's a very disturbing trend in terms of attracting private investors into the Afghanistan, which leaves us basically with the donor-funded private sector. And I think I would argue I have no problems with that as long as it's well monitored and there's accountability. And currently, I think we have too much money to be spending accountably and effectively, especially in an environment with so few weak institutions and the human resource base we have now. And I think that we're seeing that in terms of, there was the indictment a couple days ago of some contractors on a road project who tried to pay $1 million to a PRT officer to get his contracts won. There was a Mother Jones article on USPI, the private sector security companies. And so I think, all in favor of it as long as we have more accountability than I think we currently have in the system. In terms of leverage, Jerry, I don't have, I've said what I said in terms of I think let's try. I'm not necessarily optimistic we can achieve, but I think we are spending a lot of money in Afghanistan. We have our troops there. And I think we should at least make a concerted effort for the lead donors to speak with one voice, which is somewhat rare in Afghanistan, I think, with the government. And again, pick our battles. And one of the battles I would pick is that in an environment with weak institutions, key individuals, I think, do play an inordinately important role. And I think we've seen that in some cases. And the area where I think we have tried periodically, but in somewhat half-hearted manner, on the appointments issue, I think that's where the donor community really needs to try to get its act together. And on the key appointments at the provincial and central level, that more merit-based appointments be made. That is not certainly to say that political consideration shouldn't be there. Certainly, President Karzai needs to have people he can trust and feel loyal to them. Political considerations in any situation, context are important. But in return, I think we can also say that there's something we need which we're not getting now. And we're paying a very heavy price for the quality of appointments at the central and subnational level. So I would maybe start with picking that issue. And in terms of, again, realistic expectations of success, I think that those are our expectations need to be lowered and are being lowered. I'm not really in a position to say, what exactly those should be. I think, as I said before, I don't think we should pack up and leave and admit defeat. I think we can still, with another concerted effort, make some headway, but what exactly that's going to look like, it's dangerous making predictions in Afghanistan, and I'm usually wrong when I do, so I think I will pass on that one. Thank you.
Well, let me say to both panelists, thank you. I think that was a fantastic, I feel slightly guilty at having pressed you for so long. That was a long session, and you've been a fantastic audience, and please join me in thanking our panelists.